Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China by Jung Chang. Picture yourself at 15 years old. You're living in a world where your value isn't measured by your intelligence or your character, but by how small your feet are. A world where your father doesn't see you as his beloved daughter, but as a commodity he can trade for power and comfort. One ordinary day, your mother approaches you with tears streaming down her face. Tears she can't quite explain, and tells you that your life is about to change forever. You're going to become the concubine of a powerful warlord general. He's more than 3 times your age. You've never even met him. Nobody's asking for your opinion. They're simply telling you what's going to happen. If you want to refuse and be taken seriously, there's only one option. Take your own life. What would you do? This isn't some dystopian fantasy novel. This actually happened to a young woman named Yu Feng in China in 1924. And her story is just the opening chapter of one of the most powerful, heartbreaking, and ultimately inspiring family sagas ever written. This book has sold over 13 million copies worldwide, been translated into dozens of languages, and has been banned in the very country it so vividly describes. The book is Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China, written by Yu Feng's granddaughter, Jung Chang. For years, she carried her family's stories within her, memories of a China that tore itself apart through war, revolution, and madness. After escaping to the West, she finally gave voice to these experiences in the quiet of a London apartment, telling the stories of 3 extraordinary women: her grandmother, her mother, and herself. What you're about to hear isn't just a book summary. It's a journey through a century of Chinese history, seen through the eyes of those who actually lived it, suffered through it, and somehow, against all odds, survived it. It's a story about the crushing weight of tradition, the intoxicating promise of revolution, and the devastating cost of blind faith. Here's my promise to you. By the end of our time together, you'll understand not just the epic story of China's 20th century, but something profound about the human spirit itself. You'll discover what it means to find courage when you're powerless, to hold on to love in a world filled with hate, and to keep hope alive in the deepest, darkest nights. This is the story of 3 wild swans and their incredible flight through the storm. Our story begins not with a swan, but with something called a, quote, a golden lily. That was the poetic name given to a woman's bound feet, a symbol of beauty and eroticism in old China that was achieved through unimaginable cruelty. For Jung Chang's grandmother, Yu Feng, born in 1909, her greatest asset was her feet, which had been bound when she was just 2 years old. Imagine this for a moment. Her own mother, who had suffered the same fate, would take a long white cloth, nearly 20 feet long, and wind it tightly around her toddler's feet. She would bend all the toes except the big one inward and under the sole of the foot. Then she would place a heavy stone on top to crush the arch. The pain was so agonizing that young Yu Feng would scream until she passed out. Her mother would gag her with a cloth, weeping as she did it, telling her small child that this was for her own good, for her future happiness. A normal, unbound foot would supposedly ruin her life. This process lasted for years. The bones would break, but the binding had to continue, day and night, because the moment the cloths were removed, the feet would try to heal, to grow back. For the rest of her life, Chang's grandmother lived in constant, relentless pain. Her toenails grew into the balls of her feet, and the broken bones never truly healed. To walk was to teeter, like a tender young willow shoot in a spring breeze, as the poets said. This vulnerability, this hobbled helplessness, was what men of that time found desirable. Yu Feng's father, a man named Yang Rushan, was a low-level police official in a small town in Manchuria. He was ambitious but poor, and he saw his beautiful daughter as his one valuable asset. He invested everything in her. He sent her to one of the few girls' schools, had her learn chess, embroidery, and painting. He even hired a tutor to teach her to play a zither-like instrument called the Qing. He was essentially training her to be either a perfect lady or a high-class courtesan. ready to be presented to the right powerful man. That man arrived in 1924. General Zhu Zhiheng was a powerful warlord and the inspector general of the police in Peking. He was in his late 40s, handsome, imposing, and immensely powerful. It was said that when General Zhu stamped his foot, the whole city of Peking shook. For Yufeng's father, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. He couldn't make a direct offer that would lower his daughter's value. Instead, he orchestrated a series of seemingly accidental encounters. First, he told his 15-year-old daughter to go pray at the magnificent old Buddhist temple. He knew the general would be touring the town's landmarks. As Yufeng knelt in prayer, her tiny, embroidered satin shoes peeking out from under her silk trousers, her father arrived with the general. They watched from the shadows. When she stood up, teetering on her bound feet, she blushed and lowered her head, the picture of demure beauty. The general was captivated. The next step was a night at the local opera, where Yufeng was seated in a box where the general could observe her natural vivacity as she laughed and chatted with her friends. After the show, in a traditional game of lantern riddles, the general won among the men, and of course, Yufeng won among the women. The final test was her artistic talent. A few nights later, the general was invited to dinner. Afterward, Yufeng was summoned to play the king in the courtyard, under a moonlit sky filled with the scent of syringa. The general was enchanted. Before the evening ended, he proposed to her father. But he didn't offer marriage. A man of his station already had a wife, chosen for political and social reasons. He offered to take Yufeng as his concubine. A concubine was essentially an institutionalized mistress, someone to be acquired and discarded at will, with no rights and no real status. For Yufeng's father, this was more than he could have hoped for. Chang's grandmother only learned of her fate a few days before the ceremony. She wept at the thought of being a concubine, but there was no question of refusal. To oppose a parent's decision was unthinkable, a betrayal of one's ancestors. The only way to truly say no was to commit suicide. And so, at 15, she bit her lip and said nothing. General Zhu, however, was generous. He promised a full wedding ceremony, which would give her and her family a great deal of face. He bought her a large, stylish house of her own in her hometown, which meant she wouldn't have to live in his main residence, under the thumb of his wife and other concubines. At 15, Yufeng knew little of what being a concubine truly meant. She was even a little taken with the general's handsome, martial demeanor. She thought perhaps she could win his love and be happy. The wedding was the grandest the town had ever seen, with a procession, an orchestra, and a sedan chair carried by 8 men. For 3 days the general stayed with her. He was gruffly affectionate but spoke to her of no serious matters. A man was supposed to remain grand and reticent, even with his women. After a week, he told her he was leaving. He didn't say where he was going or when he would be back. Her duty was simply to wait. She had to wait 6 years. For 6 years, Yufeng lived as a prisoner in her gilded cage. The house was luxurious, but the servants were also her guards and spies. She was almost never allowed to go out alone. The general had told her a chilling story about another concubine who had been unfaithful. He had her slowly choked to death with alcohol dripped onto a gag. For a woman to betray her husband is the vilest thing possible, he had said casually. At 15, Chang's grandmother was petrified. She lived in constant fear. Her days were spent trying to kill time. She read novels, tended to her flowers, and played with her cat. She was never short of money. The general's allowance arrived every month, but she was desperately lonely and miserable. Her only connection to life, the general himself, had vanished, and as the months turned into years, her longing for him faded into a dull, objectless restlessness. Sometimes the anxiety would become so great she would fall to the floor in a blackout, a condition that would afflict her for the rest of her life. Then one day, 6 years after he had walked out the door, he reappeared. The general was now past 50 and seemed to have mellowed. He said nothing about where he had been, and she didn't ask. Their time together was brief, just as before. But this time, before he left, he asked her to come live with him at his country mansion in a town called Lulong. A wave of panic washed over her. To go to his main residence would be a life sentence, trapped under the same roof as his wife and other concubines, with no status and no freedom. That night, as she massaged his feet, she pleaded with him to let her stay in her hometown, reminding him of his promise to her parents. The next day, he left, alone. Shortly after, Chang's grandmother realized she was pregnant. In the spring of 1931, she gave birth to a baby girl, Jung Chang's mother. The general wrote back, telling her to name the child Bao Qin, meaning, quote, precious zither, and to bring her to his mansion as soon as they were strong enough to travel. Chang's grandmother was ecstatic. The child gave her life purpose. For a happy year, she poured all her love and energy into her daughter, managing to stall the general's requests for her to come to his home. But in the summer of 1932, a telegram arrived. The general was seriously ill. She was ordered to bring their daughter to see him at once. This time, there could be no refusal. The journey to the general's 81-room mansion was overwhelming for a woman who had never traveled and had bound feet. When she arrived, she was immediately confronted with the brutal reality of her status. A servant materialized and took her child away. She was then led into the sitting room of the general's wife. As etiquette demanded, Chang's grandmother knelt on the floor and kowtowed, saying, "I greet you, my mistress." When she was finally allowed to rise, the wife told her the rules of the house. From now on, her daughter would be brought up as the wife's own child. The girl would call the wife, not Chang's grandmother, Mama. Chang's grandmother was to treat her own child as the young mistress of the house and behave like a servant toward her. Her heart was breaking. Later that day, she was taken to see the general. He lay on a large, heated bed, looking terribly sallow and frail. He managed a half-smile and feebly stroked his daughter's head. "She is very pretty," he whispered, and then closed his eyes. Chang's grandmother could see he was dying. As a concubine, she had no rights. If the general died, she would be completely at the mercy of the wife, who could sell her into another household or even a brothel. She would never see her daughter again. She knew with chilling certainty that she and her daughter had to escape. But the mansion was a fortress, surrounded by high walls and armed guards. Escape seemed impossible. Her only hope was the general's number 2 concubine, his favorite, who ran the household. This woman also had a daughter, and she showed Chang's grandmother a surprising degree of sympathy. After a month of cultivating this fragile friendship, Chang's grandmother went to the general's wife and asked for permission to go home to fetch some clothes. The wife agreed, but when she asked if she could take her daughter to say goodbye to her grandparents, the wife refused. The Shu family bloodline could not be taken out of the house. Chang's grandmother set off alone, but instead of going to the railway station to go home, she found 2 horsemen who were willing to help her. That night, she raced back to the mansion. At a back gate, she gave a prearranged signal. The door, which had been unlocked by the friendly number 2 concubine, swung open. Her younger sister, who had traveled with her, emerged holding Chang's mother. They mounted the horses and fled into the night. By dawn, they had reached the railway station and caught the first train north. Back in her hometown, she was safe, but she couldn't take her daughter back to her own house for fear of the servants. So she hid her daughter in the house of an old school friend, whose father-in-law was a kindly Manchu doctor named Dr. Xia. Chang's grandmother then sent a telegram to the general's family, saying her daughter had fallen ill on the train and died. There was an agonizing wait. Would they believe her? Would they send thugs to drag her and her daughter back? But the family was too preoccupied with the impending death of the patriarch. Over a year later, in the autumn of 1933, a telegram arrived. General Zhu had died, and in a final, unexpected act of kindness, his last words had been to grant Chang's grandmother her freedom. At 24, after a decade of servitude, she was free, but her freedom was fragile. she was forced to move back into her father's house, which had become a cauldron of resentment and intrigue. Her father, having risen in the world thanks to her liaison with the general, now had 2 concubines of his own and treated his wife, Chang's grandmother's mother, with contempt. He saw his widowed daughter as a jinx, bad luck, and constantly pressured her to remarry. But, as a former concubine, the only offers she received were from poor men, whom her father rejected. Unable to stand the pressure, Chang's grandmother had a nervous breakdown. The doctor who was called in was Dr. Xia, the same man in whose house her daughter had been hidden after the escape. Dr. Xia was a widower in his mid-60s, a kind, gentle, and respected practitioner of traditional medicine. He was a Manchu, descended from a line of court doctors to the emperors. He was the first man to whom Chang's grandmother could truly speak her heart. Before long, they fell in love. Dr. Xia proposed, not to make her a concubine, but to take her as his proper wife, and to raise her daughter as his own. For Chang's grandmother, this was a dream come true, but for Dr. Xia's family, it was a catastrophe. He had 3 grown sons, all married, and with children of their own, all living in his house. For their father to marry an ex-concubine, a Han Chinese woman more than 40 years younger than him, and to make her their stepmother, a position demanding their utmost respect and subservience, was a humiliation they couldn't bear. They begged, they pleaded, they wept and screamed, they prostrated themselves before him. They engaged in emotional blackmail, arguing that the marriage would ruin their position in society. Underneath it all was a fear that this new wife would take control of the family's considerable assets. The family turned their venom on Chang's grandmother, accusing her of being a schemer, a gold digger. Dr. Xia stood firm. He knew that if he took her only as a concubine, she would become a slave to the whole family. His love alone couldn't protect her if she wasn't his proper wife. The conflict reached a horrifying climax. One morning, his eldest son, after a final desperate plea, pulled out a pistol. A filial son should use his death to remonstrate with his father, he declared, and shot himself in the abdomen. He died the next day. Dr. Xia was devastated, but he wasn't deterred. Soon after the funeral, he and Chang's grandmother were married. And so, in 1935, Chang's mother, now 4 years old, and her grandmother, age 26, moved into Dr. Xia's comfortable house. But it wasn't a happy home. The family treated Chang's grandmother with a veneer of formal respect that barely concealed their deep-seated resentment. She was held responsible for the eldest son's death. The rigid Manchu etiquette forced them into a performance of deference that grated on everyone. They had to bow to her, serve her, and even kowtow to her on festivals, all with hate in their hearts. Chang's mother also felt the hostility. While the adults didn't dare insult her grandmother to her face, her daughter was fair game. Chang's mother's first memories are of being bullied by Dr. Xia's grandchildren. The bullying culminated one day when they pushed her into a dried-up well in the garden. She fell hard, breaking a hip bone, an injury that left her with a permanent slight limp. This was the final straw for Dr. Xie. He decided they had to leave. In China, breaking up an extended family was seen as a great tragedy, but he knew they couldn't stay. He divided all his property among his children, keeping nothing for himself. When he asked Chang's grandmother if she would mind being poor, she replied, "If you have love, even plain cold water is sweet." In 1936, they moved to the city of Jinzhou. Dr. Xia, now 66, had to start again from nothing. They lived in a tiny mud hut in a poor part of town, on the edge of starvation. But Chang's grandmother would later say that this was the happiest time of her life. She was free from the intrigues and resentments of the extended family, free from the tedious Manchu rituals. She had a husband who loved her, and she had her daughter. The tiny hut was filled with laughter. Gradually, Dr. Xia's reputation as a brilliant doctor grew. He treated the wife of the provincial governor, who had fallen into a coma, and managed to restore her to consciousness. He helped the governor, who had 13 consorts but no children, to finally have heirs. His fame spread, and he became known as one of the 4 famous doctors of Manchukuo, the puppet state set up by the Japanese in Manchuria. By the end of 1937, they were able to move into a much larger brick house. For the first time in her life, Chang's mother felt the warmth of a secure and loving home, free from tension and bullying. This was the world Jung Chang's mother Di-hong grew up in, a world where Japanese soldiers patrolled the streets, and where schoolchildren had to bow to any Japanese person they passed, even a child. This was Manchukuo, the so-called independent state of the Manchus, ruled by the last emperor of China, Puyi, but in reality, a colony of Japan. At school, Di-hong was taught that her country was Manchukuo, and that Japan was its, quote, parent country. The lessons were in Japanese, the teachers were Japanese, and discipline was enforced with slaps and blows from a wooden club. But even as a child, she could see the hypocrisy. The schools for Japanese children were warm and well-equipped. The schools for local children were in dilapidated temples with no heating. One day, Puyi and his empress visited Jinzhou, and Chang's mother, a star pupil, was chosen to present flowers. She thought the empress was beautiful, but that the emperor, behind his thick spectacles, had piggy eyes. At first, Dr. Xia believed that the emperor was a virtual prisoner of the Japanese and didn't know about the atrocities being committed in his name, the villages being burned, the laborers worked to death in mines. But 2 events shattered his loyalty. A railway coolie came to see him, suffering from agonizing stomach pains because he could only afford to eat coarse, indigestible acorn meal. Rice was reserved for the Japanese. Dr. Xia gave him some medicine in a small bag of rice he had bought on the black market. Not long after, he heard that the man had been arrested as an, quote, economic criminal after a Japanese guard spotted rice in his vomit. He died in a forced labor camp. When his wife heard the news, she drowned herself and their baby. Dr. Xia was plunged into grief, feeling responsible for their deaths. Rice can murder as well as save, he would say, a small bagful, 3 lives. Shortly after, tragedy struck his own family. His youngest son, a school teacher, forgot to bow to a portrait of Puyi. The Japanese headmaster slapped him hard. The son, enraged, shouted back, "Big deal! It's only a piece of paper." That evening he was branded a thought criminal and had to flee. The family never heard from him again. Dr. Xia never recovered from the blow. He became a determined foe of the Japanese occupation and of Puyi. The war years were a time of increasing hardship and terror. Chang's mother and her classmates were conscripted to work in a textile factory. The Japanese children had easy jobs. The local girls had to operate dangerous spinning machines at high speed. Accidents were common. Chang's mother saw a shuttle fly out of a machine and knock out the eye of the girl next to her. The Japanese also forced the school children to watch newsreels of their army's brutality in China, films showing Japanese soldiers cutting people in half with swords, or prisoners being torn to pieces by dogs. They were a lesson in terror, designed to create fear. Chang's mother had nightmares for years. The underground resistance was active, and Dr. Xia became involved in a secret network to save prisoners. A distant cousin of Chang's grandmother, Han Chen, was an important resistance figure. He was arrested and tortured, and was about to be executed by garrote. Through a network that included the executioner himself and the old man who drove the death cart, Dr. Xia arranged for Han Chen to be taken down from the garrote before he was dead. That night, Dr. Xia and Chang's grandmother went to the execution ground, a desolate place called South Hill, where wild dogs fed on the corpses dumped in a shallow pit. They found Han Chen's body among the others, still breathing. They took him home and hid him in a tiny secret room for 3 months, nursing him back to health. "I will never forget that I owe my life to you," he told them as he left. "I will repay my debt." 3 years later, he returned and was as good as his word. By 1945, the Japanese were on the verge of defeat. In August, the Soviet army entered Manchuria, and the Emperor of Japan surrendered. The city of Jinju erupted. Japanese civilians were lynched or committed suicide. Their houses were looted. Chang's mother, worried about one of her Japanese teachers, a kind young woman named Miss Tanaka, hid her in their house. The end of one occupation brought the beginning of another. The Soviet Red Army arrived, and though they were initially welcomed as liberators, they soon began dismantling factories and shipping the equipment back to Russia as, quote, reparations. They walked into people's homes and took whatever they fancied, particularly watches. Stories of Russian soldiers raping local women swept the city. Then a new army appeared, the Chinese Communists. They were shabby and poorly equipped, looking more like beggars than a victorious army. But they were disciplined. They restored order, got the economy going again, and arrested collaborators. Chang's grandmother's father, who was still a police chief, was thrown into his own jail. But the Communists didn't stay long. The civil war with Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, or nationalists, was resuming. Mao Zedong's strategy was to abandon the cities and retreat to the countryside. One evening in late November, the Communists withdrew from Jinzhou. The next day, a new army marched in, the fourth in as many months. This was the Kuomintang. They had clean uniforms and gleaming new American weapons. People ran into the streets, cheering. At last, Chang's mother thought, "This looks like an army that really beat the Japanese." The goodwill soon evaporated. The Kuomintang officials, most of whom weren't from Manchuria, treated the local people with contempt, calling them slaves who have no country of your own. Corruption was rampant. Officials grabbed the best houses and rushed to acquire concubines. At 15, Chang's mother was highly marriageable, and her family was harassed by proposals from Kuomintang officers. She refused them all, determined to choose her own husband. This was the beginning of Chang's mother's political awakening. She had seen the cruelty of the old warlords, the brutality of the Japanese occupation, the chaos of the Russian liberation, and now the corruption of the Kuomintang. She had also heard stories from her uncle Peo, a prison warder, about the bravest prisoners he had ever seen, the Communists. "They have the strongest bones," he would say. They sang and cursed the Japanese until the very last minute. A teacher she admired, a young man named Kang, had to flee after being branded an anti-Kuomintang activist. Her closest friend, a girl named Shu, ran away to join the Communists, telling her, "They are our hope." Then her cousin Hugh, a sensitive boy with whom she had become very close, told her one snowy night that he was a communist and had to flee. He was captured and executed. The news of his death made up her mind. At 15, Chang's mother decided to join the Communists. She began working for the underground. Her first job was distributing leaflets with Mao Zedong's writings, hidden inside green peppers. It was dangerous work. A school friend of hers was caught with a pamphlet, tortured, and died. But the incident only made Chang's mother more defiant. Manchuria became the key battleground of the Civil War. Jinzhou was a vital supply base for the Kuomintang armies. The city was soon surrounded by communist forces. Chang's mother's missions became more critical. The communists needed to know the disposition of the Kuomintang troops. She was asked to act as a girlfriend for reconnaissance officers sent into the city, an amorous couple being less conspicuous than a man wandering alone. She also cultivated a friendship with a young Kuomintang colonel named Hui Ji, the grandson of a local army commander. He was disillusioned with the Kuomintang and, without ever saying so explicitly, began to help her. He would take her for drives in his jeep, and she would hide messages for the underground in the walls of primitive mud toilets along the way. He never asked any questions. He had fallen for her, and she knew it, But she also sensed he was trying to buy insurance with the communists, whose victory was beginning to seem inevitable. The final assault on Jinzhou began in September 1948. The battle was fierce. For 31 hours the city was bombarded by 900 artillery pieces. Chang's mother's family hid in an improvised air raid shelter. Dr. Shah refused to go down, sitting calmly in his room praying to the Buddha. The sky was black with smoke, and the noise of the artillery was deafening. On October 15th, the communists took the city. The battle was a turning point in the Civil War. Over 100,000 Kuomintang soldiers were killed or captured. Chang's mother was overjoyed. She felt herself to be part of this great cause. A few days later, she was summoned to meet the man in charge of youth work, a man named Wang Yu. This was the nom de guerre of the man who would become her husband and Jung Chang's father. He was in his late 20s, thin, with a dark face and big, wistful eyes. He looked more like a poet than a guerrilla commander. He was born in Sichuan province, 1,200 miles away. His family had been ruined by a lawsuit brought by a jealous business rival, and his father had died of overwork. At 13, Chang's father had to leave school and become an apprentice, working 12 hours a day and going to bed hungry every night. He saw suffering all around him. He devoured left-wing books and, inspired by the communists, called to resist the Japanese invasion, joined the party in 1938 at the age of 17. In 1940, he made the long, arduous journey to Yan'an, the communists' wartime headquarters. He loved the spirit of Yan'an, the camaraderie, the simplicity, and the sense of purpose. It seemed a paradise of fairness compared to the corrupt world he had left behind. He became a research fellow at the Academy of Marxist-Leninist Studies. He also became a convert. An early experience of being criticized for questioning his leaders in a rectification campaign only deepened his faith. He came to believe that absolute, unquestioning submission to the party was necessary for the great cause of saving China. After the Japanese surrender, he was sent to Manchuria, where he became a guerrilla commander, fighting the Kuomintang in the mountains. He was known for his courage, his intelligence, and also his fastidiousness. He brushed his teeth every day, a novelty among the peasants and guerrillas. When he met Chang's mother, he was impressed by her courage and intelligence. She was precise, a rare quality in China. He was delighted to find she was also pretty and feminine, not the fierce dragon he had imagined. A few days later, he began a course of lectures at her school. He was an excellent speaker, and the girls, including Chang's mother, were impressed. In the snow-covered, Russian-style city of Harbin, they fell in love. He wrote beautiful classical poems for her. On New Year's Eve, they shared a bottle of champagne, a drink he had only read about in foreign books. That night, they followed the new communist moral code and frankly told each other about their past relationships. Then he said he was going to write to the party committee for permission to talk about love with her, with a view to marriage. This was the obligatory procedure. The party was the new patriarch. They were married in May 1949, on Chang's mother's 18th birthday. She walked to his quarters, carrying her own bedroll, appalled at the lack of a traditional ceremony. Chang's grandmother was even more dismayed. But for these two revolutionaries, love was the only thing that mattered. Their new life, however, was immediately beset by problems. Chang's mother's application to join the party was held up. The party was suspicious of her family background and her Kuomintang connections. She was asked to, quote, draw a line between herself and her old friends. The most painful issue was the fate of the Kuomintang colonel, Hui Ji. He had been captured and was now a prisoner. Chang's mother appealed on his behalf, explaining how he had helped the underground, but her appeal was turned down. It was suspected his help had been motivated by his love for her, not by correct, political reasons. The fact that they had been seen holding hands in prison was taken as proof. Chang's father, torn between his sympathy for her and his loyalty to the party, told her that the revolution couldn't afford to take risks. Hui Ji was executed. Chang's mother felt miserable and isolated. The women in her work unit, the Women's Federation, were older, conservative peasant women who resented pretty, educated city girls like her. They criticized her for being too attached to her family, a bourgeois habit. She was even criticized for getting her mother to make her quota of shoes for the army because she didn't know how to make them herself. How could a woman not know how to make shoes? It was a sign of bourgeois decadence. Chang's father, whose devotion to the party was absolute, offered little comfort. He spoke the same language in private as he did in public. He told her she had to obey the party, even if she didn't understand or agree. Chang's mother found Jinzhou unbearable. She wanted to leave. Chang's father agreed and applied for a transfer to his hometown Yibin in Sichuan. In the summer of 1949, 2 months after their marriage, they set off on a long march of their own. The journey was a grueling ordeal. They walked for 40 days, through territory still infested with bandits and remnant Kuomintang soldiers. Chang's mother wasn't used to such hardship. Her feet were covered in blisters, and she was often exhausted to the point of collapse. What made it worse was that Chang's father, because of his rank, was entitled to travel in a jeep. He never offered her a lift, or even to carry her bedroll. It would be seen as favoritism, he said. She was a young student who needed to experience hardship for her own good. One night, she burst into tears. He clapped his hand over her mouth. "Don't cry out loud. If people hear you, you will be criticized." In Nanjing, their journey was interrupted. Chang's mother, who had been feeling sick, had a miscarriage. She had been pregnant without knowing it. As she lay in the hospital, nearly dead, the first thing she said to Chang's father when she opened her eyes was, "I want a divorce." He apologized profusely. He had had no idea. He promised to be more considerate. He washed her blood-soaked clothes, a very unusual act for a Chinese man. She agreed not to divorce him, but she wanted to go back to Manchuria to resume her medical studies. He persuaded her not to. It would be seen as deserting the revolution. Her future would be ruined. On October 1, 1949, in her hospital bed, she heard Mao proclaim the founding of the People's Republic. She cried like a child. The China she had dreamed of was here at last. Her personal suffering seemed trivial. She pledged to herself that she would stick with the revolution forever. After months of travel by foot, truck, and steamer up the Yangtze River, she finally arrived in Yibin on the eve of the Chinese New Year 1950. Chang's father had returned as a conquering hero, robed in embroidered silk. He was now the head of the county, a powerful man. Their first years in Yibin were the happiest of their lives. Chang's mother was given an important job in the public affairs department. She was no longer under the thumb of the resentful peasant women of the Women's Federation. She worked with educated, carefree people her own age. Her new boss, a woman named Mrs. Ting, was daring and unconventional. She let Chang's mother read novels, go to the cinema, and even wear a pink collar on her uniform. In 1952, Jung Chang was born, their second child, but these happy years were also a time of growing unease. Chang's father, in his zeal to be an incorruptible official, began to alienate his own family. He refused to use his position to help them, a practice unheard of in China. He vetoed his brother's promotion. He demoted his favorite sister's husband in the new civil service grading system. He even donated his family's beautiful ancestral home to a school. His strictness was deeply appreciated by the local population, who had never seen an official who wasn't corrupt. But his family was upset. Chang's mother was caught in the middle. Then, in 1953, Mrs. Ting, her boss and friend, tried to seduce Chang's father. He rebuffed her. He knew she was a vindictive woman, and he feared she would take revenge, particularly on Chang's mother. "We have to leave," he told her. For the second time in 4 years, they were forced to flee. They moved to Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan province. The next few years were a time of relative stability and progress in China. But beneath the surface, the storm was gathering. In 1957, Mao launched the anti-rightist campaign. He invited intellectuals to offer criticisms of the party, then branded those who spoke up as rightists. Over 500,000 people had their lives ruined. Chang's mother, who had to find a quota of rightists in the schools and hospitals under her supervision, faced an agonizing dilemma. She knew the people being accused were innocent, but if she didn't fill her quota, she would be labeled a rightist herself, and her children's future would be destroyed. It was a dilemma that faced millions of officials across China. Then came the Great Leap Forward in 1958. Mao, in his misguided dream of turning China into a modern power, ordered the entire population to make steel in backyard furnaces. Peasants were pulled out of the fields, mountains were stripped bare of trees for fuel, and household wokes were melted down. The result was useless lumps of iron and a catastrophic failure of the harvest. Mao's fantasies led to the greatest famine in human history. An estimated 30 million people starved to death. Chang's parents were deeply shaken. They knew the famine wasn't caused by natural calamities, as the official propaganda claimed. Chang's father wrote a letter to the Central Committee, appealing for an end to the madness. His superior, the governor of Sichuan, refused to forward it. "The party knows everything," he said, and warned Chang's father that he was risking his life. The famine and the political purges destroyed the moral fabric of the nation. Chang's father, once a puritanical idealist, became disillusioned and depressed. He was criticized for letting his revolutionary will wane. And then, in 1966, Mao, feeling his power slipping, unleashed the Cultural Revolution. He called on the youth of China to destroy the old world. Teenagers, organized into Red Guards, rampaged through the country, smashing temples, burning books, and torturing their teachers. Chang's parents, as capitalist roaders, officials who had implemented the pragmatic policies that ended the famine, became targets. Denunciation meetings became a daily ritual. Chang's mother was forced to kneel on broken glass, paraded through the streets with a dunce cap on her head, and beaten. Her health collapsed. Chang's father was also brutally beaten. His lifelong collection of books, his greatest treasure, was burned before his eyes. He wept for the first time in his adult life. At one denunciation meeting, when he was ordered to kowtow to a portrait of Mao, he refused. "I will not kneel," he shouted. Enraged, the rebels beat him again, but he stood defiant. When they screamed that he was opposing the Cultural Revolution, he shouted back, "I do oppose it, even if it is led by Chairman Mao." This was a crime punishable by death. He was arrested and imprisoned. The constant interrogations and psychological pressure drove him to the brink of insanity. Chang's mother, in a desperate gamble, went to Peking and managed to see Premier Zhou Enlai, who gave her a note that secured Chang's father's release. But he was a broken man. He returned home insane, tormented by hallucinations and paranoia. He raged at Chang's mother, accusing her of betraying him. He became violent. Chang's mother had to move out of their apartment and live in a tiny room in a gardener's lodge. Eventually, through the help of a sympathetic rebel faction, Chang's father was admitted to a mental hospital. With treatment, he recovered his sanity. But his persecutors, led by the Tings, the same couple who had driven them from Yibin, wouldn't leave him alone. They subjected him to more beatings and torture. His health was destroyed. He developed serious heart and liver problems. In the midst of this horror, Chang's father never lost his principles. The Tings offered him a deal. If he would write a poster praising them, they would forgive him. "There's nothing good to say about them," he told Chang's mother. She pleaded with him. "This is for your life. What is a poster compared to a life?" "I will not sell my soul," he answered. In April 1975, Chang's father, aged 54, died of a massive heart attack. His doctor, who had been hostile to him as a quote, had delayed coming to his aid for over an hour. Chang's father, who had given his whole life to the communist cause, had been destroyed by it. His death was a turning point for Jung Chang. She was 23. She had been brought up to worship Mao, to believe that China was a paradise. Now she saw the truth. She asked herself a question that had been buried deep inside her. If this is paradise, what then is hell? She knew she had to see the world for herself. The death of Mao in 1976 brought an end to the madness. The Gang of Four, including his widow, were arrested. Deng Xiaoping returned to power and began to reverse the policies of the Cultural Revolution. Chang's father was posthumously rehabilitated. The verdict on him was changed to a good official and a good party member. In 1978, the government announced that scholarships to study in the West would be awarded on the basis of a national academic examination. For the first time since 1949, merit, not political connections, would be the criterion. This was Jung Chang's chance. She studied frantically. She won the scholarship. In September 1978, she flew out of China. As the plane climbed, she looked out of the window at a great universe beyond. She took one last glance at the past, then turned to the future. She was 26 years old. She was leaving the land of her ancestors, the land of so much suffering and so much love. She was a wild swan, and at last, she was flying free. When you close the final page of Wild Swans, you feel as though you've lived 100 years. You've walked through the ruins of an ancient empire, felt the false dawn of a revolution, and survived the long, dark night of a madman's reign. It's more than a history book. It's a testament to the sheer, stubborn, unbreakable will of the human spirit. What Jung Chang has given us is a story that operates on so many levels. On one level, it's an intimate portrait of a family, a story of mothers and daughters, of love, sacrifice, and the deep, tangled roots that bind us together. We see the grandmother, Yu Feng, a woman born into a world that tried to break her, first by crushing her feet, and then by selling her as property. Yet she found the courage to escape, to love again, and to build a life on her own terms. We see the mother, Da Hong, a true believer who gave her youth to the communist revolution, only to have that revolution turn on her and her family with unimaginable cruelty. And finally, we see the author, Jung, a child of the regime, indoctrinated to worship a godlike leader, who slowly, painfully, awakens to the truth and finds the strength to forge her own path. But on another, grander level, this is the story of China itself. Through the lives of these three women, we witness the epic, violent transformation of a nation. We see the end of the old imperial world, the chaos of the warlords, the brutality of the Japanese occupation, the hope and idealism of the communist victory, and the subsequent descent into the nightmare of Mao's rule, the purges, the famine, the Cultural Revolution. It's a history that's often misunderstood, reduced to simple slogans or political jargon. But in Wild Swans, it becomes terrifyingly real, told not in statistics but in the details of everyday life. A bag of rice that leads to 3 deaths, a careless word that destroys a family, a poem that becomes a death sentence. The most powerful lesson, I think, is about resilience. It's about how people find the strength to endure the unendurable. How do you hold on to your humanity when the world around you has gone insane? How do you keep loving when you're surrounded by hate? The book doesn't offer easy answers. It shows us people who are flawed, who make compromises, who are sometimes broken. But it also shows us their incredible capacity for courage, for loyalty, and for love. Jung Chang's father, a man of unwavering principle, who would rather be destroyed than sell his soul. Her grandmother, who risked everything to save her child. Her mother, who endured years of torment but never betrayed her husband. These aren't superheroes. They're ordinary people who, when faced with extraordinary evil, found something extraordinary within themselves. This book reminds us that history isn't just something that happens in textbooks. It's lived, every day, in the hearts and homes of ordinary people. It shapes who we are, what we believe, and what we can become. So what can we take away from this epic journey? It's not just a story about a faraway land in a different time. It's a story about the choices we all face in our own lives. It's about the importance of thinking for yourself, of questioning authority, and of never surrendering your conscience no matter the cost. And perhaps most simply, it's about the power of family. In a world that was falling apart, the one thing that remained, the one thing that gave them the strength to go on, was each other. It's a reminder to cherish the people in our lives, to listen to their stories, and to understand that their past is part of our own. That was a summary of Wild Swans, Three Daughters of China, by Jung Chang. We've touched on the major currents of this incredible story today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only take you so far. The real power of this book is in the details, in the quiet moments of reflection, and in the sheer cumulative weight of a century of life. This summary is designed to give you a map, but the journey itself is something you must take on your own. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, if you felt a flicker of curiosity or a pang of empathy, then I urge you to pick up a copy. Reading Wild Swans isn't just learning. It's an experience that will stay with you and change the way you see not only China but the world, and the resilience of the human heart. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together. Thank you for listening.